Professor Stabler, for chairing this panel. It's an honor to share the stage with my friend and colleague, Reem Beylouni, and with Talha Chichek, who is a distinguished historian of the First World War. I would also like to thank the American University of Beirut for the very fine hospitality that we've appreciated, especially Professor Abu Hussein, Dr. Makram Rabah, Hiba Turman, and Rita Basile for their work organizing this conference. Finally, and importantly, I would like to thank the American Druze Foundation for endowing the fellowship that I hold this year that has allowed me to devote 2 academic semesters to researching full-time. In the audience, there are many distinguished historians and academics, various stages of your career. There's also a general audience interested in this topic. I hope to speak to both constituencies today. So I'm an environmental historian specialized in modern Lebanon. Environmental history involves studying the human relationship with the rest of nature and working on Middle East history. And here I want to nod to my colleagues in anthropology who are very good at identifying their subjectivity in relationship to what they study. I am keenly aware of my personal subjectivity as an Anglo-American person working on the history of a country that is not my own and the responsibility that entails. I hope to engage this subject matter in a useful way with appropriate humility, and also very importantly to collaborate with scholars working in this country. On that last note, it's a special honor for me to present a paper at AUB for the first time. I've been coming here as a researcher since 2008. So we're having a little technical difficulties with the PowerPoint. That's okay. We'll just brush past those. Let me briefly explain how I came to study the environmental history of the Druze. When I was researching my dissertation on the First World War, I went to visit the Shuf Cedar Reserve, and I sat down with the director of the conservation project there, Nizar Hanni, and he told me something that I found very interesting. He said, we, the Druze, have a special relationship with the environment. And I thought, that's an intriguing suggestion. What does he mean by that? Of course, he means that Druze people are more concerned with conservation, perhaps, than other communities. That's not something that I had the opportunity to follow up at that moment or in my dissertation, but it's something that I've turned my attention to this year. And so in that regard, I would like to sort of issue a caveat. In everyday discourse, like Nizar Hanni does, we assume these sectarian categories are legitimate categories for inquiry, right? We do this in the United States too. This is a standard mode of discussing society in ethnic and sectarian terms. We take these groupings for granted. This people does X, this people does Y. In contemporary academia, on the other hand, it is rarely acceptable to assume that sectarian and or ethnic categories represent coherent units of inquiry. For Lebanese history, the work of Osama Makdisi looms large in this regard. His seminal book, The Culture of Sectarianism, argues against the myth of what he calls the pure communal actor. Christians did not act as a unified force during the Civil War of 1860. Thank you very much. Anything but, in fact. And therefore, the lived reality contradicted European colonial discourse that Lebanese society was divided primarily along sectarian lines. By his own admission, his book drew exclusively on Christian sources, and perhaps the Druze case offers a counterpoint. Whatever the difference between Druze elites, the Druze Ahali remained united during the conflict, a fact that enabled their victory on the battlefield, despite the fact that they were only a small minority of the population of Mount Lebanon. Having raised this question as to whether or not the Druze Ta'ifa might not represent a legitimate category for inquiry, I will proceed as if it does for the purposes of my talk, and then I'll come back to this caveat at the end. Understandings of Druze history generally highlight one defining historical characteristic, and this is this commitment, as Talha said, to high-level solidarity. And a corollary of that is bravery, is prowess on the battlefield. Again, in popular discourse, this is something we can assume that's true. But as historians, we have to explain why, what historical circumstances enable those cultural characteristics at a particular moment in time. And so now I'm going to talk a little more broadly about my research on the First World War and then fit the Druze into that. So, of course, a famine happened in Mount Lebanon and Beirut during the war. 1 in 3 people lost their lives. And this is usually understood in scholarship and in popular memory as a tragedy that afflicted the nation, that everybody suffered together. This story is not wrong, but there's more to it, right? We can also spend our time sort of disaggregating the experience of the people who lived through the First World War in terms of class, in terms of gender, and in terms of sect. So why were death rates in Beirut and Mount Lebanon about 1 in 3, but in the surrounding regions less than 10%? The answer to that is pretty simple, and it relates to the very particular, what I call historical ecology that existed in Mount Lebanon. Silk production represented a third of income here, remittances 46%, all other sources 21%. What happens during the war, of course, is it becomes impossible to export silk to France. It becomes very difficult to import remittances from the United States, but not totally impossible. So recently I've been working on this project to visualize the remittances that were sent to Mount Lebanon during the war, which helps me distinguish the way that migration had impacted Beirut and Mount Lebanon from the surrounding regions. Of course, the administrative geography of the day is different and confusing in a sense. In green, you see Beirut province represented, and you see that very large dot down there. So this is an outlier. Lebanon, your average inhabitant of Mount Lebanon receives 30 cents from the United States during the war. In Beirut province, your average inhabitant receives 19 cents. And that figure is inflated by a group of people who live around Safad and Tiberias. And these, of course, are Jewish colonies in that area. But among Arabic-speaking populations, the way that Lebanese gain their income is very different than the surrounding regions. And so I put this data set together based on a ledger that exists in the U.S. consulate at Beirut. And this has allowed me to make what I hope is an important scholarly contribution at the same time that we're doing this in conjunction with the Kerala Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies, where we're putting this online, and it's sort of an ancestry.com for members of the Lebanese diaspora to find their relatives. You can go on this interactive map, and you can click village by village, and you can find recipients of remittances from the United States. So what I've just done is generalized about the Lebanese experience. Why did the Lebanese suffer more during the First World War than other populations? Well, because they were more dependent on global capitalism, because they were less ecologically autonomous. Well, good. But it's also important to look region by region and understand which regions were more impacted by migration, which regions were more dependent on silk. And the part I've just told is relatively well known. This, what I'm showing right here, I hope is a new contribution to our understanding of the First World War and how migration had impacted different regions differently. So we know, of course, that in Zahle, because they had access to grain supplies, the Zahalani suffered much less. They didn't suffer death rates to the same scale as other regions. And the reason for that is very simple. They weren't reliant on silk, and they had become prosperous because of the money sent back from the United States. But what's curious here, to me, is you can see where in Mount Lebanon migration had shaped the human ecology the least, and that's the Shuf Mountain region, which created sort of an interesting question to me. So why is the Druze experience here different? You know, what distinguishes it? So my aim today is to ask what particular historical conditions enable the Druze to consistently resist the imposition of control by outside forces. And this, of course, is what Talha was talking about in his presentation. And he hedged between saying that the Druze resisted Jamal Pasha, they resisted conscription because of this high level of solidarity, but also because of their access to grain supplies. While it is clear that the Druze have consistently, since the early modern period, been able to resist outside authority, we cannot assume in a scholarly context that the ability to maintain autonomy results from some kind of innate cultural or much less racial proclivity for freedom. As historians, we must seek to describe the historical conditions that enabled successive Druze gambits to conduct their own affairs without outside interference. To that end, today I'm tackling the specific case, World War I, to explore the basis of Druze autonomy. And I think the challenge of writing Druze history, and this is something I'll return to at the end of my talk, is the relative inaccessibility of archives relevant to the Druze experience. I think the audience might have some good ideas about how to address this issue, and this is something I'll come back to at the end of my talk. So what do I mean by ecological autonomy? Druze communities were sometimes more or less able to resist authority. Of course, the Jebel Druze was occupied by Ottoman forces in 1913, right before the First World War, right before they regained autonomy. However, sometimes they were defeated by powers that wanted to subjugate them, of course by Ibrahim Pasha in 1837 and 1838, eventually by the French, but relative to other communities, they were able to sustain campaigns of resistance against well-equipped state adversaries. This, I argue, is because of the outlet provided to them by the Hauran region. Mount Lebanon was already a grain deficit human ecology and therefore susceptible to a blockade. That is, most populations here were susceptible to a blockade of grain, like Ibrahim Pasha did to the Christian population in 1837, 1838, but the Druze population was able to resist until the Egyptian army poisoned the wells in the Hauran. So that's how I see sort of the factor that's enabling or limiting their autonomy is access to ecological resources, in that case, fresh water. So it's said that the one question of historical interpretation that unites the Lebanese is the consensus that Jamal Pasha victimized the nation through a program of intentional starvation during World War I. This view appears in scholarly as well as popular media. This 1967 film by Fayrouz Seferberlik, of course, encapsulates this battle between Lebanese nationalism and a genocidal Ottoman army. In this account, nationalist leaders organized an underground resistance against wartime Ottoman rule. So downtown, of course, in Martyrs Square, these elite men are memorialized as martyrs of the nation and are a key touchstone that's a key touchstone of collective memory. So how do the Druze fit into this? Already during the war, Shakib Arslan had to combat the charge that, unlike most of the elites who took a nationalist stance against the Ottomans, he had collaborated with Jamal Pasha and abetted the starvation of Christian populations. This accusation against the emir was supposed to taint the Druze population more broadly as collaborators with an outside oppressor and as potential traitors to the nation in a time of crisis. On many levels, I found this account unsatisfying. The most egregious misrepresentation made by the nationalist narrative in this regard is to suggest that the elite class in general resisted the Ottomans, with some notable suggestions. In fact, powerful families of all sects, Maronite, Orthodox, Greek Catholic, Muslim, and Druze, worked with and not against Jamal Pasha. Contrary to the armed resistance portrayed in Seferberlik, of course in Seferberlik they pick up guns against the Ottoman regime and they fight them. In that regard, the nationalist narrative, as presented here in Seferberlik, is a total fabrication. Nobody attacked Ottoman troops until they were withdrawing until October 1918. By the way, I really like this movie, and I bring it up because it's such a poignant expression of how World War I has been understood in Lebanon. I think that the nationalist narrative of the war fulfills two functions. One is positive. It's to create unity among people, a national feeling. The other, I think, is less salutary, is to deflect blame away from the crisis, is to deflect blame towards Jamal Pasha, away from local elites. Nonetheless, stories of the war do not always seek to unite. As I have mentioned, this erroneous idea that the Druze had collaborated with the Ottoman regime while Christians resisted originated during the period of the war itself. Rumors about the Druze having sided with the Ottomans abounded in British Egypt during the war and appeared in newspapers such as the Journal du Caire. Druze writers in exile objected to what they called blackmail in the strongest terms. The immediate concern of these men in exile was that they would have been seen to betray the British cause. In order to refute the charge that the Druze had become lackeys of the Ottoman regime, they invoked the central trope of Druze history as this manifestation of a proud freedom. One letter in the British archive explained the expression of loyalty to the regime made by inhabitants of the Hauran in the fall of 1914, which Talha referred to as, quote, a trick to gain time to enable them to cultivate their lands and to prepare themselves for resistance if necessary. He continued, the Druze are the only people in Syria who ever dared to draw the sword in the face of the Turkish tyrant, and they have done it continually. Even if they did not actively resist the Ottomans, the Druze of Hauran, unlike the surrounding populations, the provinces of Beirut and Syria, resisted conscription of themselves and their draft animals, and were spared having to participate in Jamal's ill-fated attack against the Suez Canal. This letter finishes saying, The Druze are an independence-loving people. They have never been totally subjected by any power during their existence, and their continual wars with Turkey are proof of this. They expect of any power which may govern them to give them a sort of independence. So Shakib Arslan throughout his life had to continue to combat these accusations that he had collaborated with Jamal Pasha and the regime. This supposed blemish on the emir's life rests on the assumption other elites were then engaged in a patriotic struggle against the Turks. Arslan's supposed close relationship with the Ottoman regime cast doubt over the actions of the whole Druze sect as having sided with the Ottoman government while it was massacring Armenians and starving the Lebanese. In fact, local notables of all sects coordinated with the Ottoman regime. The Druze population's distinct relationship with Jamal Pasha was predicated on its particular connection to the environment. The Ottoman government desperately needed grain supplies during the war, which enhanced the bargaining position of the Druze relative to other communities, who found themselves in the opposite situation of having to beg Jamal for grain. Instead of seeking their fortunes abroad, Druze of Mount Lebanon had generally looked toward the great lands of the Syria interior in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. When the war saw Lebanon largely cut off from remittances and unable to export silk, Druze recourse to the interior became a blessing. As a community, I hypothesize, the Druze were therefore more ecologically autonomous than the Christian populations of Beirut and Mount Lebanon. In conclusion, Druze history can therefore be seen as sort of a counterpoint to the fate of the rest of Lebanon during the war, which exemplified the precarity, the vulnerability introduced by capitalism here in the decades preceding it. In broad global terms, the Druze experience testifies to something that can inform the experience of all humans, namely the importance of maintaining a stable and secure relationship with the environment. Today, environmental history has helped me account for the particularity of the Druze experience during World War I and to suggest a broader environmental framework that can help us reassess familiar questions. I hope to engage popular understandings of history in a productive way. For our part as professional scholars, again, we cannot explain why things happen based on the innate, timeless characteristic of peoples, as did previous generations of Orientalists. If we rely on unchanging cultural factors to understand history, we will not be able to explain why things happen. That framework can only give static explanations that do not conform to the dynamic realities of history. I do not dispute the pervasive popular and scholarly accounts that emphasize how Druze communities resisted subjugation to outside forces because they were brave and covetous of their freedom. Those are not false, but what human community does not claim to possess those same characteristics? My question, however, is what enabled Druze resistance and autonomy? Answering that will likely give us a more useful insight. So, having done this, I think the next step is to disaggregate the experience of the Druze. We can use colonial sources to generalize about the Druze experience, like Talha did, like I did as well. But it's a worthwhile endeavor. But we also need to be aware of diversity within the Druze community in terms of class, gender, and region. And to achieve that, we need access to local sources. So whereas extensive family archives exist in Druze communities, they are largely inaccessible. Scholarship is skewed towards Christian communities of Lebanon because the archives of Christian religious institutions, especially Uzek and Bekirke, have been easier for historians to access. I would like to suggest that a digital repository online would allow researchers in Lebanon and would encourage historians to write a more vivid history of the Druze. Those who are willing to have their family papers reproduced would contribute to that endeavor. And I hope to adopt that as a project as the American Druze Foundation Fellow. Thank you very much for your attention.